The silence between them stretched like a bridge neither was ready to cross, yet somehow they found themselves sitting closer than they ever had before. Larry Howard's words echoed in the quiet apartment like a confession he hadn't meant to make. He didn't want to feel alone, he'd said, and then he'd sat beside Raymond Watson without speaking, their shoulders almost touching on the small couch. The weight of everything unsaid hung in the air between them, heavy as storm clouds gathering on the horizon, pregnant with the promise of rain that could either nourish or destroy. Raymond's heart hammered against his ribs as he stared at the television screen, not really seeing the images flickering there in the blue-white glow that painted their faces in ethereal light. He could feel the heat radiating from Larry's body, could smell the familiar scent of his cologne mixed with something else, something that spoke of vulnerability and need in the kind of raw honesty that only emerged in moments of crisis. 3 years of friendship had led to this moment, this precipice, where everything felt poised to change or shatter completely, where the careful walls they'd built around their hearts seemed as fragile as spun glass. Larry's breathing was shallow beside him, each exhale carrying the weight of words he couldn't quite bring himself to speak. When Raymond finally dared to glance sideways, he saw that his friend's hands were clasped tightly in his lap, knuckles white with tension, fingers intertwined like he was praying to a god he wasn't sure existed. There was something different about Larry tonight, something raw and exposed that Raymond had never seen before, as if all his usual defenses had been stripped away by whatever internal storm had driven him here. The confident, easygoing guy he'd known since college seemed to have disappeared, replaced by someone who looked lost and searching, like a traveler who had suddenly realized he'd been walking in the wrong direction for years. The apartment felt smaller somehow, the familiar space transformed by the electricity crackling between them, the air itself seeming to vibrate with unspoken possibilities. Raymond wanted to say something, anything to break the tension, but every word that came to mind felt inadequate, too small to contain the magnitude of what was happening between them. Instead, he found himself shifting slightly closer, drawn by an invisible force he couldn't name or resist, like a moth drawn to flame, even knowing it might be destroyed in the process. Before we see how this ends, tell us where you're watching from and hype this video in the comments. Because this moment had been building for longer than either of them realized, through countless nights of almost touching, almost speaking, almost crossing lines they weren't sure they were allowed to cross. But to understand how they arrived at this moment, suspended between friendship and something more dangerous and beautiful, you'd have to go back to the beginning. You'd have to go back to 3 months earlier, when Larry had first started showing up at Raymond's door with that lost look in his eyes, talking about feeling disconnected from his girlfriend and questioning everything he thought he knew about himself. Like a man waking up from a long dream only to discover that the life he'd been living belonged to someone else entirely. 3 months earlier, Raymond had been grading papers at his kitchen table when the knock came, the sound cutting through the quiet evening like a stone thrown into still water. He'd opened the door to find Larry standing there in the hallway, still wearing his work clothes but looking rumpled and uncertain, his tie loosened and his hair mussed as if he'd been running his hands through it repeatedly. There was something in his expression that Raymond had never seen before, a vulnerability that made his chest tighten with concern, and something else, something he didn't dare name. "Hey," Larry had said, his voice rough around the edges like sandpaper, carrying undertones of exhaustion and confusion. "I know it's late, but I was wondering if we could talk. I mean, really talk. Not the usual bullshit about work or the weather or whatever game is on this weekend." Raymond had stepped aside immediately, gesturing Larry into the apartment with a warmth that came as naturally as breathing. They'd been friends since their sophomore year of college, bonded over late-night philosophy discussions and a shared love of terrible science fiction movies that they would dissect with the seriousness of film scholars. But this felt different, charged with an energy that made the air between them shimmer like heat waves rising from summer pavement. Larry moved through the familiar space like he was seeing it for the first time, his eyes taking in details he had never noticed before. The way the lamplight caught the spines of Raymond's books, the careful arrangement of photographs on the mantel, the small touches that made this place unmistakably home. Quote Dawes 2. Raymond had offered, already moving toward the kitchen with the practiced ease of someone who understood that comfort often came in simple rituals. It was what he always did when people needed comfort. This ritual of making something warm and caffeinated, of creating space for conversation through the familiar motions of grinding beans and measuring water. Larry had nodded gratefully and settled at the small table where Raymond had been working, his fingers drumming nervously against the wood surface. Quote 3. Larry had said without preamble once Raymond set a steaming mug in front of him, the ceramic painted with a faded university logo from their shared alma mater. His fingers wrapped around the mug like he was trying to anchor himself to something solid, something real in a world that suddenly felt like it was shifting beneath his feet. Quote 4. Raymond had settled across from him, cradling his own mug and waiting with the patience he'd learned over years of friendship. He'd discovered early on that Larry needed space to work through his thoughts, that pushing for explanations only made him retreat further into himself like a turtle pulling back into its shell. So he waited, watching the play of emotions across his friend's face in the warm kitchen light. "She's perfect on paper," Larry continued, staring down into his coffee as if the answers he sought might be hidden in the dark liquid. "She's beautiful. She's smart. She makes me laugh. She loves me, really loves me, in a way that should make me feel like the luckiest man alive. But there's something missing, and I can't figure out what it is. It's like I'm going through the motions of being happy without actually feeling it, like I'm an actor playing a role in someone else's life." The words hung between them like a confession, and Raymond felt something shift in his chest, a tectonic movement that rearranged the landscape of his heart. He'd watched Larry and Barbara together for almost 2 years now, had seen the way they moved around each other with practiced ease, the comfortable familiarity of a couple who had settled into the rhythm of long-term love. From the outside, they looked like the perfect couple, the kind of pair that made other people believe in happily ever after. But sitting here in his kitchen, seeing the pain etched across Larry's features like words carved in stone, Raymond realized he'd been missing something crucial. Raymond asked carefully, his voice gentle but probing. Larry laughed, but there was no humor in it, only a bitter recognition of his own cowardice. Quoting, the question settled between them like a challenge, heavy with implications that neither was quite ready to face. Raymond found himself studying Larry's face in the warm light of his kitchen, noticing things he'd trained himself not to see over the years. The way Larry's eyes seemed to search his face when he talked, looking for something Raymond had never dared to offer. The way his friend's gaze would sometimes linger just a moment too long on his lips when he spoke, or how Larry always seemed more himself here, in this space, than anywhere else Raymond had ever seen him. Quote to Hod 9. Raymond said slowly, choosing his words with the care of someone defusing a bomb. Quote to Hod 9. Larry's head snapped up, his eyes meeting Raymond's with an intensity that made the air between them crackle like electricity before a storm. For a moment, neither of them spoke, the silence stretching taut as a wire. Then Larry was looking away, his cheeks flushed with color that had nothing to do with the warmth of the coffee, his hands trembling slightly around his mug in a way that made Raymond want to reach out and steady them. Quote 11. Larry said, starting to rise from his chair with the jerky movements of someone fighting their own instincts. Quote 12, Raymond asked, and the words came out softer than he'd intended, carrying more weight than a simple question should bear. Or do you just think you should? Larry froze halfway to standing, his eyes wide and uncertain, caught between flight and something that looked dangerously like hope. Slowly, he sank back into his chair, and Raymond could see the war playing out across his features. Fear and hope and confusion all tangled together in an expression that made Raymond's heart ache with recognition. He'd worn that same expression himself countless times over the years, caught between wanting something desperately and being terrified of what it might cost. "I don't know what's wrong with me," Larry whispered, his voice breaking on the words. "Maybe nothing's wrong with you," Raymond replied, leaning forward slightly, close enough to catch the scent of Larry's cologne mixed with something uniquely him. Quote 16, that conversation had opened something between them, a door that neither could quite bring themselves to close, like Pandora's box but filled with possibility instead of chaos. Over the following weeks, Larry had started showing up more frequently, his visits becoming as regular as sunrise, as necessary as breathing. Sometimes he had excuses, a movie he wanted to watch, or a problem at work he needed to talk through. But increasingly, he would just appear at Raymond's door with that same lost expression, seeking something he couldn't name but desperately needed. Raymond found himself looking forward to these visits with an intensity that scared him, the way a recovering addict might crave their drug of choice. He'd been attracted to Larry since college, but he'd buried those feelings so deep, he'd almost convinced himself they didn't exist, building layers of friendship and casual camaraderie over them like sedimentary rock. Watching his friend struggle with his own identity was bringing everything back to the surface. And Raymond didn't know how much longer he could pretend he didn't feel the electricity that sparked between them every time they were in the same room. The breaking point came on a Thursday night in late October, when the first frost had painted the windows and the air carried the promise of winter. Raymond had been reading on his couch, lost in the pages of a novel that couldn't hold his attention because his mind kept wandering to Larry, when the knock came. When he opened the door, his friend looked more shattered than he'd ever seen him, like a man who had been hollowed out from the inside. "We broke up," Larry said without preamble, stepping into the apartment like a man walking through fog, his movements disconnected and strange. "Barbara and I, it's over." Raymond's heart did something complicated in his chest, a mixture of sympathy for his friend's pain and something else he didn't want to examine too closely, something that felt dangerously like relief. He guided Larry to the couch, settling beside him at what he hoped was a safe distance, though every instinct screamed at him to pull his friend close and never let go. Quote 19. Raymond asked gently, his voice carefully modulated to hide the storm of emotions raging inside him. Larry's laugh was bitter and broken, the sound of something beautiful being destroyed. "I told her I needed space to figure myself out. She asked what there was to figure out, and I couldn't give her an answer that made sense. How do you explain that you feel like you've been sleepwalking through your own life, that you love someone but you're not in love with them, and you can't understand the difference until it's staring you in the face?" He turned to look at Raymond then, and the raw vulnerability in his expression made Raymond's breath catch in his throat. He trailed off, his eyes fixed on Raymond's face with an intensity that made the world seem to tilt on its axis. "The way what?" Raymond prompted, though he wasn't sure he was ready for the answer. Quote 23. Larry finished in a whisper. The confession hit Raymond like a physical blow, stealing the breath from his lungs and making his heart stutter in his chest. For a moment, the world seemed to stop spinning, everything he thought he knew about their friendship rearranging itself into new and terrifying patterns. Larry was watching him with an expression caught between terror and hope, waiting for a response that could either save or destroy everything between them. Quote 24. Raymond asked, though his voice sounded strange and distant, even to his own ears. Quote 25. Larry admitted, his honesty cutting through the air between them like a blade. Quote 29. The words hung in the air between them, loaded with implications neither was quite ready to face. Raymond felt his pulse quicken, felt the familiar warmth that always seemed to bloom in his chest when Larry looked at him like that. Dika, like he was seeing something precious and fragile that he was afraid to touch. Quote 27. Raymond started, but his friend was already shaking his head. Quote 28. Quote down, and Larry's eyes met his, and Raymond saw his own longing reflected there, saw the same careful hope he'd been carrying for years like a secret flame. Quote 30. The confession hit Raymond like a wave, bringing with it years of suppressed longing and careful denial. He felt something crack open inside his chest, all the walls he'd built around his heart crumbling under the weight of Larry's honesty. Quote 31. Raymond managed to ask, his voice barely audible. Quote 32. Quote 30. Larry's smile was sad and beautiful, like sunlight breaking through storm clouds. Since college. Since that night, junior year, when you fell asleep on my shoulder during that terrible horror movie marathon, and I realized I didn't want you to ever move. I spent the whole night memorizing the weight of you against me, the way you smelled, the sound of your breathing. I told myself it was just friendship, just caring about someone important to me. But I was lying to myself even then. The memory hit Raymond like a wave, bringing with it the phantom sensation of Larry's fingers carding through his hair that night, the steady rhythm of his breathing, the way Raymond had pretended to sleep longer than necessary just to stay close to the warmth and safety he found in his friend's arms. He'd convinced himself that night meant nothing, that the warmth he'd felt was just friendship, just the comfort of being cared for by someone who mattered to him. But sitting here now, seeing the truth written across Larry's face like words in his native language, he realized they'd both been pretending for far too long. I thought I was imagining it, Raymond whispered, his voice thick with years of suppressed emotion. The way you looked at me sometimes, the way you always seemed to find excuses to touch me, brushing my hand when you passed me something, fixing my collar when it was crooked. That time you traced the scar on my palm and asked how I got it. I thought I was projecting my own feelings, seeing what I wanted to see instead of what was really there. Your own feelings? Larry's voice was barely audible, but Raymond could hear the hope threaded through it like gold thread through dark fabric. Raymond admitted, the words tumbling out in a rush like water breaking through a dam. Quote 39. Larry's eyes widened, and for a moment he looked stunned, as if someone had just told him the sky was actually green and the grass was blue. Then he was moving, closing the distance between them on the couch until their knees were touching, until Raymond could see the flecks of gold in his brown eyes, could count his eyelashes and map every expression that crossed his face. 5 years, Larry repeated, his voice full of wonder and regret. We've wasted 5 years dancing around each other, both too scared to say what we really felt. Not wasted, Raymond said softly, reaching out to trace the line of Larry's jaw with trembling fingers. Quote 43. Larry's hand moved tentatively toward Raymond's face, his fingers hovering just inches from his cheek, as if he was afraid this might all disappear if he moved too quickly. What 44? Raymond's answer was to lean into the contact, closing his eyes as Larry's palm cupped his face with infinite gentleness, the touch sending electricity racing through his veins like lightning in his bloodstream. Every nerve ending suddenly came alive and singing, awakened from years of careful dormancy. When he opened his eyes, Larry was watching him with an expression of such tender amazement that it made his chest tight with emotion. Quote 45. Larry whispered, his thumb brushing across Raymond's cheekbone with reverent care. For the first time in years, something feels completely right. Like all the pieces of my life are finally falling into place. Raymond covered Larry's hand with his own, pressing it more firmly against his face, savoring the warmth and reality of the touch. He admitted, his voice breaking slightly on the words. Quote 40, and Larry countered, his voice steady and sure in a way that made Raymond's heart skip. What if this is what we've been looking for all along, and we just couldn't see it because we were too afraid to look? What if we're exactly what each other needs, and we've been denying ourselves happiness for no good reason? The question hung between them, full of possibility and promise, heavy with the weight of all their tomorrows. Raymond could feel his walls crumbling, all the careful defenses he'd built over the years dissolving under the weight of Larry's gaze like sugar in rain. This was the moment of no return, the place where everything would change one way or another, and there would be no going back to the careful distance they'd maintained for so long. Quote 50, Larry said, echoing the words that had brought them to this precipice, his voice carrying the weight of years of isolation and pretending. Quote 52. Raymond felt tears prick at the corners of his eyes, overwhelmed by the simple honesty of the statement and the way it echoed his own deepest feelings. Ta, he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. Larry's other hand came up to frame Raymond's face, and suddenly they were breathing the same air, existing in the same small space that felt infinite and impossibly intimate. Raymond could see every detail of Larry's face, could count his eyelashes and map the curve of his lips, could see his own reflection in the depths of Larry's eyes. Quote 55. Larry asked, the words barely a breath between them, carrying the weight of years of longing. Raymond's answer was to close the final distance between them, pressing his lips to Larry's in a kiss that was soft and tentative and absolutely perfect. It was nothing like the desperate, passionate embraces he'd imagined over the years during his loneliest moments. Instead, it was gentle and questioning, a conversation conducted in touches and sighs, in the careful exploration of something precious and new. Larry's lips were warm and soft against his, moving with careful reverence, like he was afraid Raymond might disappear if he pressed too hard. Like this might all be a dream that would shatter at the first rough touch. Raymond felt years of longing crystallize into this single moment, All the dreams and fantasies he'd harbored suddenly made real and somehow more beautiful than anything his imagination had conjured. Larry's hands were trembling against his face, and when they finally broke apart, both of them were breathing hard, their foreheads pressed together as they shared the same air. Quote 56. Larry whispered, his voice full of wonder and disbelief. Quote 57. Quote 52. Raymond agreed, not trusting himself to form more complex thoughts when his entire world had just been turned upside down and rearranged into something beautiful. His entire being had narrowed to this moment, to the feel of Larry's breath against his skin and the way their bodies seemed to fit together perfectly, like puzzle pieces that had been searching for each other across years of careful distance. They stayed like that for a long time, foreheads touching, sharing the same air, neither willing to break the spell that had settled over them. Raymond could feel Larry's pulse racing beneath his fingers where they'd somehow found their way to his neck, could feel the rapid flutter of his heartbeat that matched his own frantic rhythm. Everything felt heightened, every sensation amplified until he was dizzy with it, drunk on the simple reality of finally being able to touch Larry the way he'd dreamed of for years. Quote 59. Larry asked eventually, his voice rough with emotion and uncertainty. Quote 60. Raymond admitted, his honesty cutting through the moment like a gentle blade. Quote 60. Larry pulled back slightly to look at him, his eyes searching Raymond's face with an intensity that made him feel seen and known in a way he'd never experienced before. Bastard Cutters, and Raymond said with a shaky laugh that carried years of pent-up emotion. Guatan. Larry's smile was soft and understanding, full of the same mixture of fear and hope that Raymond felt coursing through his own veins. We don't have to figure it all out tonight. We could just see what happens. Take it one day at a time, one kiss at a time, one moment at a time. One day at a time, Raymond repeated, testing the words on his tongue like a foreign language he was learning to speak. They felt manageable, less overwhelming than trying to plan out the rest of their lives in a single conversation, less terrifying than trying to map out a future when he was still reeling from the reality of the present. I'd like that. Larry leaned in to kiss him again, and this time Raymond was ready for it. His body and heart opened to the sensation in a way they hadn't been before. He kissed back with more confidence, letting himself sink into the sensation without overthinking it, without analyzing every touch and breath and sigh. Larry's hands tangled in his hair, and Raymond made a soft sound of pleasure that seemed to encourage him, seemed to give him permission to deepen the kiss. When they broke apart this time, Larry's eyes were dark and warm, full of promises and possibilities that made Raymond's heart race with anticipation. I should probably go, he said, though he made no move to pull away, his hands still buried in Raymond's hair. Quote 69. Raymond nodded, though every fiber of his being wanted to ask Larry to stay, wanted to pull him close and never let go. The relief that washed over Larry's features was almost painful to witness, like watching someone who had been holding their breath finally allowed to breathe again. I was so afraid you'd think I was just using you as some kind of experiment, or that I was confused and would change my mind in the morning, that I'd wake up and decide this was all a mistake. Are you confused? Raymond asked gently, his voice carrying no judgment, only genuine curiosity and concern. Larry considered the question seriously, his brow furrowed in thought as he weighed his words carefully. About some things, yeah. About what it means for my life, about how to navigate all of this, about what to tell people, and how to explain the fact that I'm apparently not who I thought I was. But not about you. Not about the way I feel when I'm with you. That's the one thing that's felt clear for months now. The only thing that makes sense in a world that suddenly seems upside down. Raymond felt something loosen in his chest, a knot of anxiety he hadn't realized he'd been carrying since the moment Larry first kissed him. Okay, that's enough for now. That's more than enough. Larry stood slowly, as if reluctant to leave the warm cocoon they'd created on the couch, their bodies still drawn together by invisible threads. Raymond walked him to the door, hyper-aware of every inch of space between them, of the way the air seemed to shimmer with possibility and promise. At the threshold, Larry turned back, his hand on the doorframe, looking like he wanted to say something but couldn't find the words. Thank you, he said finally, his voice simple but weighted with meaning, for being patient with me, for letting me figure this out at my own pace, for not running away when I told you the truth. Thank you for trusting me with it, Raymond replied, his own voice thick with emotion. For being brave enough to say something, for taking the risk when you didn't know how I'd react. Larry leaned in to press one more soft kiss to his lips, a promise and a question all at once, a gentle benediction that tasted like hope and possibility. Then he was gone, leaving Raymond standing in his doorway with his heart racing and his entire world rearranged, watching until Larry disappeared around the corner before closing the door and leaning against it, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what had just happened between them. The next few weeks passed in a blur of careful exploration and growing confidence, like learning to walk in a new world where all the rules had changed overnight. Larry came by almost every evening, and they fell into a new rhythm that felt both foreign and completely natural, like a dance they'd been practicing in secret for years. They would cook dinner together, talking through the complexities of Larry's changing understanding of himself, while their hands found excuses to brush against each other, reaching for the same spice, steadying each other while navigating the small kitchen. The casual intimacy of shared domestic space suddenly charged with new meaning. They would watch movies on the couch, sitting closer than they ever had before, Larry's head sometimes finding its way to Raymond's shoulder with a naturalness that belied years of careful distance. The physical intimacy grew slowly, carefully, like a flower opening to sunlight after a long winter. Kisses became longer and more frequent, hands began to wander, mapping the familiar territory of each other's bodies with new permission and purpose. Larry was like a man discovering a new language, sometimes hesitant and sometimes bold, always amazed by his own capacity for this kind of connection. He would trace the lines of Raymond's face with wondering fingers, as if he couldn't quite believe he was allowed to touch like this, couldn't quite convince himself that this wasn't all an elaborate dream. Quote 79, Larry admitted one night as they lay tangled together on Raymond's couch. Come on, the television forgotten in favor of quiet conversation, their bodies fitting together like they'd been designed for this exact configuration. Quote Adiem. Raymond's fingers traced lazy patterns on Larry's chest, marveling at his freedom to touch like this, to explore the landscape of his friend's body without pretense or apology. Maybe that's your answer right there. Maybe when something is right, it doesn't feel scary. It just feels like coming home. Larry tilted his head to look at him, his eyes soft in the lamplight, full of wonder and gratitude, and something that looked dangerously like love. Is that what this feels like to you? Coming home? Every time you walk through that door, Raymond admitted, his voice thick with emotion. Every time you look at me like I'm something precious. I spent so many years feeling like I was waiting for my life to start, and now I realize I was just waiting for you to be ready to see what was right in front of us. Larry's response was to kiss him, deep and thorough and full of promise, his hands tangling in Raymond's hair as he poured years of suppressed feeling into the contact. When they broke apart, both breathing hard, Larry's eyes were bright with unshed tears that caught the lamplight like diamonds. He whispered, the words falling between them like a benediction, like a prayer answered after years of faithful waiting. Karashish, Raymond felt his heart expand in his chest, felt years of careful hope finally bloom into something real and sustainable and beautiful. Code 87. They made love that night for the first time, slow and reverent and absolutely perfect, like a conversation conducted in touches and saishas and whispered endearments. Larry approached every touch, every kiss, every whispered word with the wonder of someone discovering a new part of himself, exploring this newfound capacity for intimacy with careful reverence. Raymond had never felt so cherished, so completely seen and accepted for exactly who he was. Afterwards, they lay wrapped around each other in Raymond's bed, Larry's head on his chest, their legs tangled together in a configuration that felt as natural as breathing. The silence between them was comfortable now, full of contentment rather than tension, heavy with satisfaction and the promise of all the nights to come. Kodao, Larry asked eventually, his voice drowsy and satisfied, muffled against Raymond's chest. Whatever you're comfortable with, Raymond replied, pressing a kiss to the top of his head, breathing in the familiar scent that had come to mean home and safety and everything good in the world. We don't have to figure it all out tonight. We have time. I want to tell people, Larry said, surprising him with the firmness in his voice. I want to tell everyone. I'm tired of hiding who I am, tired of pretending to be someone I'm not. I want the whole world to know that I'm crazy about you, that I've found something real and beautiful and worth fighting for. Raymond's arms tightened around him, overwhelmed by gratitude and love and the simple miracle of being wanted so openly, so completely, Larry said firmly, lifting his head to meet Raymond's eyes with an intensity that took his breath away. I want to go forward, with you, for as long as you'll have me. 3 months later, they were hosting their first dinner party as a couple. Raymond's small apartment transformed into something warm and welcoming, despite its modest size. The space was crowded with friends from college and work, the air filled with laughter and the smell of the elaborate meal Larry had insisted on cooking, claiming he needed to prove his domestic worthiness to their social circle. Raymond watched from across the room as his boyfriend, still marveling at his freedom to use that word, still feeling a little thrill every time he thought it, charmed their guests with stories and easy humor, his confidence in this new identity growing stronger every day. The transition hadn't been without its challenges, like navigating a river with hidden currents and unexpected rapids. Larry had struggled with questions about his identity, wondering if he was gay or bisexual or something else entirely, spending long nights researching and reading and trying to find a label that fit the reality of his feelings. They'd had long conversations about labels and expectations, ultimately deciding that what mattered wasn't the name they put on Larry's sexuality, but the reality of their connection. The simple truth that they loved each other and wanted to build a life together. Some friends had been surprised by the revelation, their eyebrows shooting up in shock before settling into acceptance. Others had claimed they'd seen it coming all along, insisting they'd always sensed something special between Raymond and Larry that went beyond ordinary friendship. Larry's family had taken longer to come around, his mother going through what she called her mourning period for the grandchildren she'd imagined before eventually embracing Raymond with the fierce protectiveness she usually reserved for her own son. Barbara had been gracious about the whole thing, which had surprised everyone, including Larry himself. She'd told him she was happy he'd figured himself out, that she'd sensed something was missing, but hadn't been able to put her finger on what it was. She was dating someone new now, someone who looked at her the way Larry looked at Raymond, with complete adoration and the kind of focused attention that made everything else fade into background noise. Quote 97, Julie Thompson said, appearing at Raymond's elbow with a glass of wine and a knowing smile that suggested she'd been watching him watch Larry for several minutes. She'd been one of the first people they'd told, and she'd responded by saying she'd been wondering when they'd finally get their act together, claiming she'd been taking bets with mutual friends about how long it would take. Quote 98. Raymond replied, not taking his eyes off Larry as he gestured animatedly while telling a story about their recent disastrous attempt at assembling furniture, his hands moving in elaborate patterns that made their friends laugh. Quote 99, a quote there 100. Julie observed, taking a sip of her wine. Quote 101. Raymond laughed, finally turning to face her with a grin that felt like it might split his face in half. Quote 102. Quote about and quote 102. Julie nearly choked on her wine, laughing so hard she had to grab onto Raymond's arm for support. Too much information, but I'm glad you're happy. Really happy. You both deserve this after all those years of dancing around each other like idiots. Across the room, Larry caught Raymond's eye and winked, causing a familiar warmth to spread through his chest like honey in his veins. Even after 3 months, the simple fact of being able to look at Larry with open affection still felt like a miracle, like something he'd never quite believed would be possible. No more hiding, no more pretending, no more careful distance maintained for the sake of preserving a friendship that had always been something more. The evening wound down slowly, friends gradually trickling out into the night, with promises to do it again soon and comments about how good it was to see them both so happy. Larry and Raymond worked together to clean up, moving around each other in the kitchen with practiced ease, their bodies finding a rhythm that spoke of countless shared meals and domestic moments. It was domestic and comfortable, and everything Raymond had dreamed of during those long years of secret longing. That went well, Larry said as he loaded the last of the dishes into the dishwasher, his sleeves rolled up and his hair slightly mussed from the evening's activities. Raymond replied, wrapping his arms around Larry from behind, savoring the solid warmth of his body and the way he immediately relaxed into the embrace. Quote 109. Larry leaned back against him, solid and warm and perfectly real, his hands covering Raymond's where they rested against his chest. No more setups necessary. I'm very thoroughly taken, completely off the market, absolutely and utterly yours. Raymond hummed, pressing a kiss to the side of Larry's neck, tasting salt and the faint remnant of his cologne. Quote 112, quote 103, Larry said without hesitation, his voice carrying the weight of absolute truth. Quote 114, they swayed together in the kitchen, no music except the quiet hum of the dishwasher and the distant sounds of the city beyond the windows, the soft symphony of a life being lived. Raymond marveled at how simple it was, how easy, all those years of complication and confusion, and it turned out love was the simplest thing in the world when you found the right person to share it with. Quote 115. Raymond asked one lazy Sunday morning 6 months later as they lay in bed, newspapers scattered around them like fallen leaves and coffee growing cold on the nightstand in mismatched mugs they'd collected from various coffee shops around the city. Taking the risk, I mean, changing everything between us. Larry looked up from the crossword puzzle he'd been working on, his hair sticking up at odd angles and his reading glasses perched on the end of his nose in a way that made him look professorial and adorable. He looked rumpled and domestic and absolutely beautiful, like something Raymond might have dreamed up during his loneliest moments, but never quite believed could be real. Quote 117, he said without hesitation, his voice carrying the weight of absolute certainty. So I'm the pod one entered, Raymond asked, playing with a strand of Larry's hair that had escaped his careful styling, wrapping it around his finger and watching the way the morning light caught the subtle highlights. What if you'd risked our friendship for nothing? Larry set down his pen and turned to face him fully, his expression serious and thoughtful. Then I would have respected that and found a way to be your friend anyway, because losing you completely wasn't an option. But Raymond, I was dying by inches, pretending not to feel what I felt. I couldn't keep living that way, couldn't keep settling for half of what I wanted, when what I really wanted was right there, sleeping in the next room when I stayed over, making me coffee in the morning, being everything I needed without even trying. And now? Now I wake up every morning next to the person I love most in the world, Larry said, his voice soft with wonder, as if he still couldn't quite believe this was his life. Quote 124. Raymond felt the familiar tightness in his chest that came whenever Larry said things like this, whenever he was reminded of how close they'd come to missing this entirely, to spending their lives in parallel lines that never quite intersected. I love you, he said simply, because sometimes that was all there was to say, the only truth that mattered in a world full of complications and uncertainties. I love you too, Larry replied, leaning in for a kiss that tasted like coffee and Sunday morning and the promise of all the lazy days to come, all the ordinary moments that would add up to a lifetime of shared happiness. They'd been talking about moving in together officially, though Larry spent so many nights at Raymond's place that it was more a matter of making it legal than changing their actual living situation. They'd been talking about a lot of things, actually. The future felt wide open and full of possibility in a way it never had before, like a blank canvas waiting for them to paint their dreams across it. Quote 127, Larry asked, settling back against the pillows with his crossword, his body warm and relaxed beside Raymond's. This, Raymond said contentedly, gesturing at the scene around them, the rumpled sheets, the scattered newspapers, the coffee cups, and the easy intimacy of a Sunday morning with nowhere to be and nothing to prove. Exactly this. Stay in bed with you and pretend the rest of the world doesn't exist. I like that plan, Larry agreed, then frowned at his puzzle with the concentrated expression he got when wrestling with a particularly challenging clue. What's a 7-letter word for unexpected discovery? Miracle, Raymond suggested, only half joking, thinking about how miraculous it felt that they'd found their way to each other despite all the obstacles and fears and years of careful distance. Larry looked at him with that soft expression that still made his heart skip, his eyes bright with love and gratitude and the kind of happiness that seemed to radiate from somewhere deep inside him. Quote 133. As Larry wrote in the answer, Raymond reflected on the strange turns life could take, the way happiness could sneak up on you when you least expected it. A year ago, he'd been resigned to loving Larry from a distance, content with friendship, because it was all he thought he could have. Now they were planning a life together, building something real and lasting and beautiful out of the foundation of years of friendship and newly discovered love. The silence stretched between them again, but it was the comfortable silence of two people who no longer had to hide anything from each other, who had learned to exist in the same space without pretense or performance. Larry worked on his crossword while Raymond read the news, their legs tangled together under the covers in a configuration that had become as natural as breathing. It was ordinary and extraordinary all at once, this simple intimacy they'd fought so hard to find. Larry said eventually, setting aside his puzzle with the careful movements of someone about to say something important. 130. Larry's smile was soft and full of love, carrying the weight of everything they'd been through together and everything they still had to look forward to. The church sign of quote 47, quote weird to Ian. Raymond set down his newspaper and pulled Larry closer until they were nose to nose on the pillow, sharing the same air and the same space and the same impossible happiness. Quote 139, quote 140. And Larry whispered, and then he was kissing Raymond with all the passion and tenderness of someone who had finally found their home, their person, their place in the world. Outside, the city hummed with life and possibility, but inside this small apartment, in this bed they now shared, the world had narrowed to just the two of them and the love they'd built together from the ashes of years of careful friendship and patient waiting. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Larry rested his forehead against Raymond's and smiled with the kind of joy that seemed to light him up from the inside. Quote 141, quote 142, quote 143. Raymond's heart soared even though he'd known this conversation was coming, had been preparing for it and hoping for it in equal measure. Quote 100 foreign, quote Querns, Larry said decisively, his voice bright with excitement and possibility. Quote Washington, quote Warren, Larry's eyes were bright with certainty and love, shining with the kind of happiness that made Raymond's chest tight with emotion. Quote 148. Raymond felt tears prick at the corners of his eyes, overwhelmed by the simple honesty of the statement and the way it echoed his own deepest feelings. But watch to quote Wafdi. Larry said, pressing a hand over Raymond's heart, feeling the steady rhythm that had become the soundtrack to his happiness. With you. Always with you. For as long as you'll have me. They spent the rest of the morning making plans, talking about the kind of place they wanted to find and the life they wanted to build together, their voices bright with excitement and possibility. It felt surreal and wonderful, this freedom to dream about a shared future, to plan for all the ordinary moments and extraordinary adventures that lay ahead of them. Raymond had spent so many years carefully not imagining what it would be like to wake up next to Larry every morning. And now he didn't have to imagine anymore. As the sun climbed higher outside their windows, painting the room in golden light that made everything look soft and dreamlike, Raymond marveled at how perfect this felt. Not perfect in the sense of being without challenges or complications, but perfect in the sense of being exactly right, exactly what he'd been searching for without even knowing it. They fit together like puzzle pieces that had been scattered for years before finally finding their way home. I love you, he whispered against Larry's hair, breathing in the familiar scent that had come to mean safety and home and everything good in the world, everything worth fighting for and building a life around. Quote Marta, Larry replied, his voice thick with emotion and contentment. Quote Winter, and in that moment, wrapped around each other in the bed they now shared, with the promise of all their tomorrows stretching out before them like an uncharted map waiting to be explored, Raymond understood that sometimes the most beautiful love stories were the ones that caught you completely off guard. Sometimes the person you were meant to love had been right there all along, waiting for you both to be brave enough to reach for what you really wanted, patient enough to let love grow in its own time and in its own way. The silence between them now was full of contentment and possibility. No longer the charged tension of things unsaid, but the comfortable quiet of two people who had finally found their way to each other after years of careful circling and patient waiting. And as Larry's breathing evened out against his chest, Raymond smiled and closed his eyes, knowing that when he woke up, Larry would still be there. Not as his friend who didn't want to feel alone, but as his partner, his love, his home, his future, his everything. They were both exactly where they needed to be, exactly where they belonged, exactly where love had always been leading them.